Welcome, everyone. My name is Shanti Gonzalez, and I am the Senior Manager of Candidate Recruitment and Training for LCV. It's nice to see you all here today, and we will have more people continue to arrive as we get started here. But I want to welcome our two presenters for today. Oh, Kevin, I didn't know you had another first name, so I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute here. I know him as Kevin Alasanoye from Collective PAC, and Renata Thornton, my colleague at the League of Conservation Voters. And what we're hoping to do today is to help candidates and future candidates to understand the role of data in planning a winning campaign. We want to help candidates to understand how to determine their win number and understand the factors that can shape and influence that win number, and then share a little bit about the work of Collective PAC and LCV with candidates and future candidates. And so just a little bit about LCV. We build political power for people and the planet. We influence policy. We hold politicians accountable. We win elections. And that's our strategy to fight to build a world with clean air, clean water, public lands, and a safe climate that are protected by a just and equitable democracy. And then my role at LCV is to do candidate recruitment and training, both long-term and short-term. So we just finished our Candidate Academy for this year, and I know some of our Candidate Academy alums are here on this call. And then long-term, we have a Boards and Commissions Fellowship grant that we are working in 2 states. We'll add a 3rd state this year, and that's a long-term strategy, C3 strategy, to build this pool of people who are serving in boards and commissions today, but someday could be tapped to run for elected office. And Kevin, you want to introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about the work of Collective PAC and how you guys work with candidates?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me, Shanti, and really look forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, and sorry, Kevin, can you and Renata come on camera if you're able?
Looks like I'm not able to, says the host to stop.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me, thank you for telling me. And you both should be able to, come on, there we go. Okay, good. There he is.
There we are. So
right,
I'm joined, my name is Tolu Lokwe Kevin Alasanoye. I'm the National Political and Organizing Director for the Collective PAC. I'm joined this afternoon by my Chief of Staff, Elijah, who many folks who have had a meeting with me or seen me around, he's always around. Hopefully we'll nap through this conversation because I'm going to bore him to tears, but excite y'all, light you up. The Collective PAC, we are the biggest, the boldest, strongest organization, I think, in the country dedicated to building Black political power. We were started in 2016 by our president and co-founder and his wife, Quentin James and Stephanie Brown James, with a mission of electing Black candidates who run for office all up and down the ticket across the country. We're one of the only organizations in the country that will get involved in every kind of race, from a congressional race to a statewide or state legislative race, even down to the local level in mayor's races, council races, county races, and everything in between. As I said, our goal is to build Black political power. So we do that by supporting Black candidates that run for office, but we also do that by engaging and empowering Black voters to show up to the polls and vote on election day. Over the last 5 years, we have helped to elect 300 candidates across the country. And this year, we're looking to endorse somewhere between 200 and 250 candidates who will be on the ballot in their primary or in the general election, respectively.
Thank you. So we want to start here because until you know this, it's hard to do anything else on your campaign. So Renata, can you introduce yourself and then also walk us through this?
Yeah, so my name is Renata Thornton. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Data and Analytics Manager at LCV. And I do a lot of work to assist our climate action programs, which is a continually running climate field campaign that happens in 5 different states. And I do a lot of work to assist everybody in tracking metrics for that. and all other data synchronization needs to make sure that all the tools we use to organize people all get communicated back into our main CRM van to ensure that we're tracking everything and meeting all the goals we want to meet. But today I'll be talking a little bit about how to use data in this specific instance, and the importance of and how to use it on campaigns. So the first thing is calculating your win number, which is very important because that informs the rest of your strategy onwards. So first you'll want to find go to the last most similar three elections that occurred. So I'm going to use Virginia as an example because there's an election every year. So last year, for example, in 2021 was a governor's and House of Delegates race. And so if you were running for the House of Delegates seat, you would want to look at which occurs every 2 years in an off year. You would want to look at 2021, 2019, and 2017 as the years that you're as the races you're interested in, because those are the most similar years to look at for turnout. So you would get those three turnout numbers and then add them together, divide it by 3, and then multiply it by 0.52, which is the margin that I would consider important, because you can technically win a race with a little bit over 50, but we should aim for better safe than sorry. So 52 should be where we're aiming to be. Things can change that, but and you can still technically win below it, but we should try for a little bit more comfort. And so in the example that's on the side here, so if the elections in this Virginia House of Delegates race, if the turnout was 37,000 in last year, so 2021, 34,000 in 2019, and 29,000 in 2017, you would add those all together, 100,000, divide it by 3, 33,000, and then multiply that number by 0.52. So that 52% margin of victory that we're looking for, and that brings us to 17,333 people that we need to try to get on your side. And now that we know that information, if you go to the next slide, you'll look into what you need to do to get those people there in the first place. So first, it's important to figure out where the voters that you're looking for are concentrated. So first, there's some data that you can find publicly and very easily, and some of it that you'll need voter file access for. But for this part, a lot of this you can find on your Secretary of State website, Ballotpedia, lots of publicly available information that's easily findable. So you can look at precincts and in the race that you're running for. You can look at all the precincts that are available that will be in the district and see which precincts had the highest turnout, and then see if there's a common denominator in terms of what's occurring in those specific chunks of the community, and focus some of your efforts there. Next, if you're running in a partisan race, you can also look at the past few elections and see how the Republican and Democrat fared, or Independent fared in each one, to see if it's even realistic for you to even get towards that win number. So seeing if the vast majority of the district that you're running in is 70% Republican and you're a Democrat, then it's probably not fully feasible for you to get to that win number. And sometimes you have to be honest with yourself about that. But if it's a little closer margin, if it's more of a 60-40 or a 50-50 type thing, you can then look into adding more voters into the pool to make it more realistic for you to win in the first place. So that would be with doing some voter registration outreach and going into parts of the community that may not have received as much attention, and trying to increase turnout and increase voter registration efforts there. I will note that every state has different rules in terms of becoming a voter registration agent, or if you have to, some states you have to go through an entire process with your like the county or the Secretary of State in order to like do it. And then other states, you're allowed to literally just get a form and start walking out and asking people to like register to vote. There's lots of rules associated with that, so please do research on that. But that is an option as well in order to increase the pool and make your race more viable in that sense. And lastly, it's important to kind of just do some demographic research of your district in general or where you're running. So you all that's publicly available through census information. You should see if your district skews younger or older. If you have a lot of younger voters, maybe you should tailor how you contact them in ways that are more engaging to younger people. And if it's older voters, being just aware of the different communication styles that different generations have. Second, also looking at if you live in a place where there's lots of immigrant communities, making sure that you put your literature in another language that's accessible so that it's understandable to people. Also, I had an experience one time where we were canvassing in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood where there were some like undocumented people. And so people felt very anxious opening the door when random people were knocking on the door, just a lot of anxiety in terms of opening it because they didn't know who was there. So just being aware of the communities that you're in and having to just adjust your outreach based off of the communities you're in and understand. And I think getting volunteers who are familiar with those communities are all helpful things. And if you move to the next slide. So in the last slide, I mainly talked about data resources that are publicly available, but once you actually move to the part of your campaign where you're going to start doing direct voter contact, so phone banking, canvassing, like talking to individual voters, like in any means, shape, or form, you'll need to then move on to getting some sort of voter file access, which in most areas, you should be able to get that access from your state party. So once that occurs, you'll at the beginning of your race, you'll want to be looking into first doing persuasion and pulling persuasion lists. So in a persuasion type list, you would want to find people with high to medium support scores, and support scores go from 0 to 100, 100 being like the best case scenario for you. So picking people for like 50 up, depending on the race, maybe even higher. And then turnout scores that are kind of in the medium to high range. This is also good for primaries because you want to pick people who are like for sure Democrats or like people that you're interested in and who like are going to turn out. So that period is like the most important to find people who are like medium to high support. And then once we like move towards the end of the campaign in the final weeks, you'll want to switch your outreach to a get out the vote effort, which basically the only difference between the two is putting less emphasis on people who are already high turnout voters, because if we already know that people are going to turn out, we shouldn't put resources onto them because like it's a limited time. We should move towards the people who we're a little less sure, or those people who we've been persuading who are a little iffy. This is the time to really like dig in, like get that like final effort and put that final push into those people, because we already know that others are, if like this one for people who've been volunteering, they've been doing all this stuff and they've always turned out, they're going to turn out again. We should put our efforts towards those who we're less sure of. So yes, you can get access to these models and be able to like track these metrics, get access to VAN from state parties who will give you all the access you need to this. Also, when you reach this point in your campaign, you should consider hiring staff to assist with the metric tracking and targeting at this point. And the parties usually do have like a lot of information on people who can be consultants, like part-time consultants to assist with this, or hiring full-on staff. But this is like the period where it's important to consider that. And lastly, there are a couple nonpartisan schools to check out. if you are interested in that, there's one called Aristotle, and a couple others. And if you want more information on that, please reach out after. But that's it.
We have a last slide that has contact information for both of these guys, so stick around for that. Great. Kevin, did you want to chime in on anything that you've heard so far, either about how to expand your voter pool or this targeting piece?
Only I'll say that this targeting piece is the place at which, in my opinion, the campaign begins to get real. Because in theory, anybody can run for office, but there is a practicality to whether you can actually find the votes that are necessary to get to 50% plus one where you need to be. And as you get deeper and deeper into this process, from starting with calculating your win number to then trying to figure out, okay, now that I have my win number, how do I make sure that I have talked to enough people to get to that win number, right? And included in that win number are also, you're going to talk to people who say they're going to vote for you and say they're going to be supportive of you, but may not actually show up on election day, may not actually cast a vote. And so more than your win number is also a target number for the number of identifications or IDs that you need, right? And that ID number is going to be much higher than your win number. And then you're going to have to try to figure out, as you build your campaign, how do I turn as many of the folks who told me that they're going to be supportive of me into actual voters on election day?
Good point. All right, so Kevin, can you talk us through what can impact turnout?
Yeah, I think obviously you want to look at historical trends, right? So as you're doing the analysis of what happened in previous election cycles, you also want to look at contextualizing that information. Were there contested primaries? Were there uncontested primaries? Was there a contested general election race? Was it not? Was there an incumbent on the ballot? Was there not an incumbent on the ballot because it was an open seat? I think understanding or contextualizing what is happening within a specific election cycle helps you to make good guesses about how many folks are going to show up. So for example, in 2016, turnout was about where it normally was for a presidential election cycle, give or take in the 30 to 40% range in terms of number of overall votes that were cast against the number of eligible voters. What we saw in 2018 in the midterm cycle was an explosion of turnout. People really came out to vote. And in 2020, you had the most turnout you have ever seen in a presidential election ever. So if you're trying to make a guess about what turnout is going to look like in 2022, you might say, hey, we're going to have explosive turnout because I looked at the last 3 elections and each successive election, it's gotten better and better and better. Not so fast. I would say you're probably better off looking at how did the midterm election look like in 2014 or 2010, because the political climate in the country is much more like that time than it was in maybe 2018. And so that's what we mean by sort of researching historical trends, is trying to figure out, as you think about where the issues are, as you think about kind of where the mood of the electorate is this year more similar or less similar to another election year? I think, again, you also need to know what else is happening on the ballot. And that doesn't necessarily mean elections, right? A lot of states will have ballot initiatives that are on the ballot, and those could also drive turnout. I remember in my first election cycle in 2006, there was a ballot initiative on the ballot in the general about a casino in my home state. And so a lot of folks showed up to vote for the casino ballot initiative, not necessarily for the race that I was working on. And the question we had to ask ourselves was, how do we make sure that the folks that are showing up for that question are also voting in our election? Third thing is, how competitive are those top of the ticket races? The truth be told, if you're on the ballot, on the bottom of the ballot, it's important for you to build good organization to turn your voters out. But if you have really competitive races in a US Senate race or in a governor's race or in a congressional race, that can also really, really impact the turnout. I'm thinking about the Dallas area of Texas, where on Tuesday, in Congressional District 30 in Texas, there will be a primary election race for the first time in almost 30 years. And folks are trying to figure out, like, what does turnout look like there? Well, why don't we take a look at what's happening above the ticket, right? You've got a not so competitive primary election race in the governor's race, not expected to be a very competitive primary election, at least on the Democratic side in the LG's race. Looks like you're going to have a pretty competitive AG race on the Democratic side. All of those factors are things that folks need to take into account when they're trying to figure out what is going to happen in the congressional race. Finally, how fired up are people? Look, I think I'll go back to the example that I used in 2018 and 2020. I think on the Democratic side, you saw explosive energy, right? And so as we were getting ready to get into those general elections and even in the primary elections, you could see every time folks had an opportunity to vote, 2 or 3 more percent of people voted in that election versus the previous election. And that number just continued to tick up and up and up. I think you need to kind of get a sense for what does turnout look like based on where the energy is. I think that's also true of what is happening on the opposite side, right? So it's one thing for your base to be energized, but one thing we saw in Virginia on the Republican side was there was a lot of energy on that side as well, right? So whether your energy on your side, on the Democratic side, matches the Republican side is also another thing that is something that you have to take into account.
Thank
Next
you.
slide.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that's super important to spend a little bit of time talking about is mail voting and vote by mail. I think the dirty little secret before 2020 was that Democrats outperformed Republicans and independents far and away in vote by mail. You're starting to see more and more of this, I think, in the aftermath of 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtually everybody who voted in 2020 voted by a mail ballot. There were not that many people, comparatively speaking, who actually walked into a voting booth and cast a ballot. And I think as states try to find more ways to be able to give folks the right to exercise the franchise without them having to show up to a polling location on election day, you're going to start to see more and more of this stuff, right? I think related to that, the rules around vote by mail are changing all the time. And so it's something that you have got to be paying attention to. It used to be there were, some states have what are called no excuse mail ballot applications, which essentially says you can get a mail ballot for any reason under the sun. In some states, you have to have a specific reason why you are requesting a mail ballot versus being able to go and vote on election day. And so I would just encourage you, wherever you're running, whatever state you're in, be very cognizant of what the rules are specifically around vote by mail, and be sure to account for how many folks are voting by mail as you're calculating your win number. You also need to look at how many people in those recent elections that you looked at are people who cast their votes by mail, because what you don't want to be is in a position where half the votes are cast during the mail ballot period, and then you're expecting your vote to come in on election day and your opponent gets out ahead of you because half the vote has already been cast. And so the other thing that I would say here is, banking votes is a super, super effective way to keep your costs down. I think a generation ago, election day was the game, right? Like everybody kind of geared up. And the 4 days before election day, which are called get out the vote, you energize the supporters, you talk to them as many times as you possibly can until they get to the polls. But what we're figuring out now with early vote is that election day is now election days, And in some states, it's election month or weeks, right? And so if you're building out a strategy for how you're going to get your votes to the polls, part of what you're also going to have to consider during that time is how am I making sure that that happens early? And as you're doing that early, it also can help you cut down your costs for GOTV specifically, because it could be that there are just not that many votes that are out there that are left because most people have already cast their votes.
Thanks, Kevin. Renata, anything to add on the mail voting stuff?
No, I think Kevin covered it.
Great. All right. Kevin, did you want to share anything on this piece about how best to reach voters?
Yeah, I just think that multi-layered, multi-channel communication is the best way to go, right? Think about all the different ways that we interact with each other and ask yourself, how am I showing up and being present in that space? How am I getting my message out? There are older voters who still pick up a newspaper. So the question you have to ask yourself is, in print media, how am I showing up? How am I sharing my message? For younger millennial voters or Gen Z voters, they're consuming all their information in the social media space. So ask yourself, how am I showing up in that space to make sure that my message is getting out? And then look, I'm a field organizer. I came up doing field organizing. There are some tried and true methods about voter outreach that always work. Knocking on doors, making phone calls, sending text messages. Again, contextualizing that for your district. Are you, if you've got a large Latinx population or a large AAPI population, how are you making sure that you're reaching folks where they are, speaking to them in a language that they understand and sharing the message about your candidacy to them? I think you got to think through all the different ways to be able to do that and show up in all the various spaces. The final thing here is just about, a piece of advice around senior buildings. I remember as a young field organizer in my home state, there was actually a law on the books that wouldn't allow us to go into a senior high rise and knock on individual doors. So we had to be very creative about how did we reach the senior population, because one of the things we knew is they were showing up to vote. Many of them, their facility that they lived in served as a polling place. So they didn't have to go outside to go and vote. They just literally had to take the elevator downstairs and the polling place was right there. And so we wanted to make sure that we talked to those folks. And so what did we do? We hosted a whole bunch of like dinners in the high rises, right? Where we brought the seniors down. They got a chance to meet our candidate. We fed them, we talked to them about why it was important for our candidate to be elected. We made sure we had the best cookies, because you have to do that in the senior high rises. And then we handed them literature as well that they could take back up to their rooms. And so on election day, if they were still kind of on the fence and trying to figure out who was it that they were going to vote for, we had given them all the tools to be able to make those decisions. I think wherever you're at, whatever kind of race you're running, you have to think critically about those things as well and ask yourself, in the places where people are, how am I meeting them? Some of that stuff is going to require you to do sort of the traditional way of reaching out, but I would say don't be afraid to be creative as well.
Yeah. When I ran for school board in 2014, there was a lot of voters I was never able to talk with, even though we did a super heavy door knocking campaign, because they lived in these gated communities. And so I hate phone banking, but that was the only way that I was going to be able to connect with them, except by mail, right? And so like you just have to flex your strategies when there's just not going to be a traditional way to reach people.
Yeah, Shanti, I'll give you one more example. When I moved to the New York metro area a couple of years ago, it stunned me that like the way of campaigning was to like go to a diner and do a diner stop. If you were running statewide, you literally just showed up to a diner in the middle of the day during the lunch hour and you shook a bunch of hands with a bunch of folks. Or if you were in New York City, you'd go to a train stop and you just wait by the most crowded train stops as people were getting on and off the subway, and hand out your literature and talk to folks there, because that's the easiest way, the cheapest, most effective way for you to be able to do that. And so I think, again, it's just about understanding the demographics of the district that you're in and meeting people in the places that you are to be the most efficient.
Yep. Okay, I see a couple questions. We're almost done here. We just got 2 more slides and then we're going to take your questions. So this one, and I hope that Renata and Kevin will chime in, but just that it's really important to understand who the influencers are going to be in your race. You know, every neighborhood has some neighborhood and civic organizations. Those are really important influencers around issues like crime and development and traffic safety and things like that for people running for city council. Obviously, if you're running for a transit board, you're going to have important people who are leaders on transit issues, education organizations for school board races. In some districts, faith leaders or business organizations are going to be really important, and they're especially important to you if you're not part of a faith community, or if you don't have any background in business, entrepreneurship. Having some connections in those communities, building those relationships are really important. And then especially if you don't look like some key segments of your district, messengers are really important, because the most effective person to speak to a particular community may not be you, right? But if that person believes in you, they want you to win, they think you'd be good for the district, then that can be a really important messenger on your behalf. So just think about, you know, depending on your race, who are the key people who are influencers about helping candidates win and be seen. So we want to share our contact information here. So please make a note if you want to talk to Renata about some nonpartisan candidate tools. If you want to talk to me about anything, if you're running and want some advice, obviously Kevin is a great resource as well. So please reach out to us. In the meantime, I know that Colleen has her hand up. So Colleen, I'm going to allow you to speak and go ahead and share your question. You got to come off mute though. Okay, well, why don't we come back to Colleen? There's another question in the Q&A. Jeffrey Perone asks, Kevin, what do you mean by banking votes? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for the question. So think of election day as a bank. And on election day, every voter that votes is depositing a vote into your bank. And when you have more votes than the other person in your bank, that's how you win. What I'm trying to suggest by saying you bank your votes is that if people are voting early, then you want to make sure that you're getting as many of those votes into your bank as possible, right? Because you could win election day. On election day, you could get more votes. But if you don't get as many votes as you need to during the early voting period, you can lose. And in fact, that is the substance of the former president's argument as it relates to his gripes about what happened in the 2020 election. It's not that he didn't win on election day, he did in a lot of states. The problem was Democrats were voting for months earlier in some places. And so they had banked enough votes so that by the time you got to election day, even though they may have lost the total number of votes that were cast on election day, because they had banked all of those votes, they ended up winning in states like Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, where 4 years ago they did not do that, right? And so that's the concept of banking, is just about when are people voting, how are you making sure that you're getting your fair share of all of those votes, not just on election day, but in every segment where they're voting. Some states have in-person early voting, so people are waiting in line to vote early. Some people are voting by mail. And the question you have to ask yourself as you're building out your strategy is, how many of these folks do I need to win in these buckets of votes to be able to be successful? So breaking down your win number is just the beginning of that process. It's far from the end.
Thanks, Kevin. Colleen, I think you're unmuted now. You want to share your question?
Oh, hi. I didn't realize I had a question, and I noticed you said my name, so I'm just trying to figure out. I didn't know if you had asked me a question.
You had
or
raised
what was
your
going
hand.
on.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have bumped my phone.
Okay, no worries. Is there
Okay.
anyone else who would like to, oh, I think there's maybe something more in the Q&A here. Let's see here. Oh, it's the same question. Okay. So are there any other questions for our speakers? You can either raise your hand or you can pop it into the Q&A. And if not, I don't know, maybe Renata and Kevin, you guys were so thorough that everybody's good. You guys have some of the best people in the country here, so please take advantage of this time with them. So we'll wait 2 more minutes and then we'll just call it, I guess. I don't know if Kevin or Renata, you had any questions for each other.
No questions. I'll just say final thoughts here as people are kind of thinking of what they might be willing to ask. Renata did a really good job of explaining you just sort of the math that it takes to be able to get to how you win. But I think it is critically important to talk through all the various pieces that we talked about, because as I said at the top, knowing how many votes you have to get is only part of the equation. You not only need to know what the total number is, but then you need to break down how many of those votes came in vote by mail, how many of those votes came voting early in person, how many of those votes came in on election day. Who were the voters who did that? Were they older voters who voted earlier? Were they younger voters who voted later? Were there specific segment of the population that voted? Maybe there was a drive in the inner city to be able to have some folks. Maybe you live in a suburban district and you haven't seen that much. All of these different factors are things that you have to consider as you're not only getting to your win number, but then actualizing and contextualizing it like we talked about. And there are so many layers of that onion that you've got to peel back as you're kind of making decisions about whether you're going to run or not. And I think these are the types of homeworky type questions that are not fun, they're not sexy, they're hard, but these are the hard questions that every person who is running for office has to be asking themselves before they sign up to do it. Because make no mistake about it, it ain't fun, right? Like, it's not fun doing the call time. It's not fun doing the events. There is a sacrifice that comes with public service. And I think if you're gonna make that sacrifice, you ought to know exactly what you have to do to be able to get there, because otherwise, frankly, it's just not worth it.
Thanks, Kevin. There's another question. The information you just mentioned, Kevin, about who votes how, Lily Williams asks, will all that information be available in the Vote Builder program?
I'll defer to Renata, but my experience is yes. So typically in Van and in Vote Builder, you're able to see not only who voted, but how they voted. So you're able to see, did they vote by mail? Did they vote in person? Every state's a little bit different. But the way that that program works is it's based on Secretary of State's data or election administration data. So depending on your state, it could be your county or your statewide Secretary of State. And they keep records of how votes are cast, who cast them, and when. That is all public. And send that over to state parties who then work to get that information into the Vote Builder program. So if you're pulling down an individual voter's profile, you should be able to see, who, not only who voted and when that individual voted, but also how they cast their vote.
Great. Let's see. It seems like, this is Jeffrey, it seems like if the number of voters in the similar elections are trending up significantly, taking a simple average of the last 3 could be very misleading. Has anybody written down a more detailed mode or algorithm that would take into account the other factors that Kevin mentioned?
So typically there is, like, before an election year, some of the big data companies do predictive models to predict how election turnout will fare. for like a given year. It's usually on larger scale elections though. Like there are very lots of money going into creating models to predict turnout for like the midterm elections, and there always will be in presidential years. But if you're working in you have an election in what's considered like an off year, so in an in-between year, like if it were like next year, for example, the like access to some of that information is not as like great. But a lot of that information would be like, it is like given at the national level and then is dispersed to like the states on a statewide level, so that your state party would have like a lot more information about like those more detailed models.
And the only other thing that I would add to what Renata just said is that the further down ballot you go, the less reliable the models actually are, because their models are intended to be national in scope. That's the only way the science actually is predictive, right? What you're trying to do is say, if there are 100 people who have this kind of a profile, we can predict how many of the 100 people will behave in a certain type of way. It becomes much harder to do that when you're talking about a state legislative race or when you're talking about a council race. And so the answer to the question is, Jeffrey, it's part science and part art, which is why when we say go back and look at the similar elections and do the calculations from a numbers perspective, that's the kind of tried and true scientific method. And then the art part of this is going to be all the other factors and layers that we talked about here, which could potentially increase or decrease the numbers in terms of what turnout looks like and in terms of what your win number will look like. I wish I could say there was just like a checkbox. If you check this 7 to 10 things, it spits out a number. But the reality of this is that what we're trying to ultimately do is protect human behavior, and human behavior is incredibly unpredictable. There are some methods that are better than others, and we've tried to share the ones that we know that we have experienced are useful. But like I said, I think at the end of the day, every candidate, every campaign has to take these factors that we talked about and contextualize them based on the best possible information that they have to make good decisions.
Great. Well, I think that's it for questions. John said very thorough, and I need to mull this over. I don't have any questions right now, but thank you guys for that. And then I don't know if Kevin or Renata, you want to have any closing comments? And also, Kevin, as an organization that does endorsements, what are you looking for when you're assessing whether somebody has a plan a plan for their path to victory?
Yeah, this is a great question. So a few things. If you are a Black or African-American candidate who's on the call, who's interested in seeking an endorsement from the Collective PAC, you should go to www.collectivepac.org, and you can find our candidate questionnaire right on the website. We'll also drop this in the chat for folks so they can find it. In terms of what we look at, I think two things. Some of this is formulaic. So yeah, we want to understand what is your win number? How do you actually get to your win number? And then we ask a lot of other questions that are mostly political and infrastructural. Who is supporting you? What kind of organizations have you been able to garner support from either labor or other political leaders, national leaders? How is your fundraising going? How much money does it typically cost to do this kind of a race that you're running it? How much have you raised so far? What is your plan to be able to raise the money over time? How do you intend to spend the resources that you have raised? Are you planning on going up on TV if you're running in a statewide race? How do you do your paid communication strategy, whether that's mail or digital? What does your infrastructure look like? Who are the consultants that are working with you, or who are the volunteers that are helping you out? We take a look at a number of different factors. And then I would say on the policy side, what is your you know, what do you believe in? What is your value set? And how does that match up with our value set in terms of the things that we care about? As we talked about earlier, you know, the Collective PAC is all about sort of building Black political power. And we're all about, you know, supporting candidates who are going to uplift Black people and have good policy that's going to help to level the playing field and give Black folks an opportunity to be successful across the country. So we look at, you know, where do you stand from a value perspective with where we stand, and is there alignment on those things? There's a number of different factors. This is another one of those where, again, I wish I could just tell you like, hey, check the box on 6 out of 10 of these and you're good to go. It's not quite that easy. But what I will say is that a very well prepared campaign is one that has the answers to the how many votes do I need to win? Where are those votes going to come from? What's my strategy or plan of attack to get them? Doesn't mean that you're going to be 100% successful, but the more of kind of this homework that you're able to do on the front end, it will give you the ability to then really think about how you're effectively communicating to folks who don't, who are not in your campaign, who are not in your district, what that kind of path down the yellow brick road looks like.
Renata, any parting thoughts or advice for our candidates on planning their path to victory?
Start early. Probably going to take a lot longer than you think it's going to. And you're going to probably need a lot more support and like help from friends and family than you think you will. It's not always the most fun time, but it's worth it. If it's something that you want to do and you think you'll make the difference, then do it.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today for this conversation, and everybody who was able to participate. Appreciate everybody's time and efforts, and go out there, win your campaigns, and reach out to me and Kevin and Renata if we can help you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye.